Quiet Riot.
Hello, Quiet Rioters. This is Andreou flying solo today. I wanted to record a very short corrective on Farage's claims regarding comments on Ukraine and Putin in his interview with Nick Robinson that I'm sure you will have seen at least bits of. Not to engage with his opinion, just the facts. Because, yes, his opinion has elicited widespread condemnation and much of it is entirely justified, but even that is on Farage's own terms, and his terms as presented are simply untruthful. So this is what he said in that interview on his admiration for Putin.
Let's look at the man who you said was the statesman you most admire.
No, I said
Vladimir Putin.
Hang on a second. I said I disliked him.
But you said you admired him.
I said I disliked him.
But you admired him.
As a person, but I admired him as a political operator because he's managed to take control of running Russia.
Well, the quote was right, the statesman you most admired. And you did it after he seized Crimea.
This is about the same time. Maybe before. No, before. Actually before.
And this is what he said on who is to blame for the war in Ukraine.
When the war happened, the big war,
yeah,
when Vladimir Putin sent his troops across the border in 22, you blamed the West, not him. You said, I'll just read it to you and then you can react, that on a tweet, it was a consequence of EU and NATO expansion. Is that a judgment you stand by?
Right. I'll tell you what you don't know. I stood up in the European Parliament in 2014 and I said, and I quote, there will be a war in Ukraine. Why did I say that? It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and to go to war.
But you were echoing him.
Sorry.
You were echoing him. That's what Putin says.
No. Sorry, I've been saying this actually since the 1990s. Ever since the fall of the wall. But hang on a second. We've provoked this war. It's, of course it's his fault. He's used what we've done as an excuse.
But we provoked the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, and very interestingly, once again, 10 years ago when I predicted this, by the way, I'm the only person in British politics that predicted what would happen.
Right. So to sum up, one, he's not echoing Putin because he has said all of this for decades since the 1990s. Two, his comments expressing admiration for Putin were made definitely before the annexation of Crimea. And three, he stood up in the European Parliament and predicted the war. These claims in his interview have been amplified, unchecked, as facts. Here is Nick Watt on yesterday's Newsnight.
What he would say is he predicted this. He made a speech, as he pointed out, in the European Parliament in 2014, and he says, I predicted what was going to happen, Russia invading Ukraine. He predicted it, he would say.
And here is Gurpreet Narwan on Sky News this morning.
An argument that Nigel Farage has been making, as you heard from him speaking just there, in interviews since the 1990s, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and in 2014 in the European Parliament, he stood up and said, there will be war in Ukraine.
Now, all three claims are factually untrue. All of them lies. The comments about Putin being the leader he most admires were made astonishingly 2 weeks after the annexation of Crimea, which took place between February and March. His comments were in the April issue of GQ. I suppose he could have given that interview months earlier, that's possible. But when challenged about his comments 2 days after that issue was out, on the 3rd of April, by David Dimbleby in the BBC studio, he didn't say that, but tried instead to suggest that he hadn't said he admires Putin. Another lie. Here's the exchange.
I personally am delighted we didn't go to war in Syria, and we're not going to get involved, I hope, in military conflict in the Ukraine. The British people have had enough of endless foreign military interventions. The situation in the Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, these aren't simple black and white issues. And just to assume that if you support the rebels, you're supporting the good guys, frankly, flies in the face of history, and we should not be intervening. And I am not I don't admire Putin. What I said was he'd outwitted and outclassed you all over Syria. I also said I didn't like him as a human being and I wouldn't want to live in Russia.
But
what I want us to do, let's not meddle. Let's not meddle.
Hang on, just before you go on, you did actually say you admired him.
As an operator,
the question was, which current world leader do you most admire? As an operator, I would say Putin.
Yes, and I then went on to say, David, that as a human being and with what he was doing imprisoning journalists, I did not support the man.
A few days later, in another debate, Farage took this further. He accused the British government of geeing up the EU behind the scenes to expand into Ukraine and said, frankly, they have blood on their hands. Here's what he said.
The British government has actually G'd up the European Union to pursue effectively an imperialist, expansionist, and even Mr Barroso, the Commission President, once himself said, that we are building an empire. We've given a false series of hopes to a group of people in the western Ukraine. So G'd up were they, that they actually toppled their own elected leader. That provoked Mr Putin, and I think the European Union, frankly, does have blood on its hands in the Ukraine, and I don't want a European army, navy, air force, or a European foreign policy. It has not been a thing for good in the Ukraine.
Okay, so let's now examine Farage's claim that he was some oracle alone in politics who stood up in the European Parliament and predicted the war. Far from it. His only mention of Ukraine in the debate transcript came in September 2014. Several months after the annexation of Crimea, and while the EU and NATO were trying to coordinate their action to prevent escalation, and it did not predict the war, which had in effect already started, it justified Russia's action. Here's what he said.
The unnecessary provocation of Vladimir Putin. This EU empire, ever seeking to expand, stated its territorial claim on the Ukraine some years ago. Just to make that worse, of course, some NATO members said they too would like the Ukraine to join NATO. We directly encouraged the uprising in the Ukraine that led to the toppling of the President Yanukovych, and that led, of course, in turn to Vladimir Putin reacting. And the moral of the story is, if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he reacts.
He was challenged by a Romanian delegate, and his reply to that is even worse. Here's the short exchange.
Sir, in your considerate opinion, what is better, to have Russian soldiers fighting a war on the territory of Ukraine, or NATO troops exercising as a response to that on the territory of Ukraine?
Mr Farage, 30 seconds, please.
I think, sir, the point that I was making is that there should be a huge degree of guilt in this House about what provoked all of this in the first place, and we saw Western Ukrainians waving European flags, rioting, setting fire to things, and effectively staging a coup d'etat which brought down the Ukrainian president, which has led to this instability. Yes, you are the guilty people, and you refuse to accept it.
It is also a fact that Nigel Farage had never mentioned the word Ukraine in this context before that instance in any parliamentary record during his very long career. Extensive research reveals him not to have made a single intervention on the subject of Ukraine before the annexation of Crimea in any press report. So he's claimed that he's not echoing Putin because he's been saying this since the 1990s, similarly has zero basis in reality that I can find. What I did find is his response to the report into the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko. Here it is.
I think that in diplomatic terms we should try to get some of the Russian spies out of London. Actually, yes, I do. Because, whilst I don't want to go to war with Mr. Putin, I think our priority should be to make London streets safe and not to have Russian-style gangland warfare. Well, we'll have to see, and certainly when it comes to Syria, and perhaps even the bigger debate about global jihadism, what I've always said on that is, whilst I dislike many of the things that Putin does, on that greater, bigger battle, actually, we're on the same side.
And here is his response to the attempted poisoning of the Skripals in Salisbury, which resulted in the death of an innocent British civilian.
Boris Johnson from the start, who has said it's absolutely certain that the Kremlin did this. Please, Boris, either give us some information or tell us you can't give it to us for reasons of secrecy. But just to expect people to blindly believe what they're told, I'm afraid the days when we trusted our leaders that much are long, long gone.
So to sum up, he hadn't been saying this since the 90s. He didn't stand up in the European Parliament and predicted the war. He did say he admired Putin and persisted with that view after the annexation of Crimea. The only constant that I could see in Farage's reaction to Putin is his constant apologia, his constant shilling for Russian interests. It never ceases to amaze me just how little fact-checking goes on. I genuinely don't understand how it should fall to some bloke in South Bermondsey to waste his precious day off in order to do Nick Watt's job for him. But we are where we are. If you appreciate the many hours I just put into this, please take 2 minutes to subscribe to the podcast and also to say something nice about us on social media. Being a well-kept secret won't pay for the studio rental. Thank you. See you next time.
Quiet.